Today we're joined by Helen Sutton. Thank you for joining us, Helen.
Hey, you're very welcome. I've spent my life as working up towards being a chief revenue officer. I actually started my career as an engineer working in steel mills up in the Midlands, South Wales, South Africa. So that was all very character building. Since then, I've really moved into smaller companies. I started my sales career in SAP, spent 12 years there, ended up on the leadership team of SAP UK. Since then, moved more into venture, private equity, backed companies, working for great organizations like DocuSign. I ran the enterprise org there for Northern Europe, which was exciting, such high growth. It's like a company doubled every year. And then moved more into venture, a data miner, and most recently spent time as a chief revenue officer in a super private equity backed organization headquartered in Norway. And then since then, I think I've sort of, stereotype classic, reached a certain point in my life where taking a little bit more of a decision to step out and bring everything that I've learned over the years to multiple organizations. I'm doing independent consulting, advisory, board work. So that's going really well.
And you switched to, what was it, about 3 or 4 months ago?
Yes. So it's literally sort of 5 months in. So I can tell because it's 5 months since I've run a forecast call. That's kind of my measure of how things have changed. Love forecast calls, but yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk about the, life as a CRO, but there's certain sort of intensity to the cadence that goes with that.
How have you found that change and switching? I mean, it's early days, but
Yeah, it's early days. I found it remarkably easy. I think, I seem to be very fortunate. I've got a strong brand, strong network. So I've been brought in really interesting companies by people in my networks. I've just finished doing a 3-month piece of work working with a UK fintech on their 3-year growth plan to grow them from 50 million to 100 million, for example. And they've just asked me to sort of stay on and do work with them, bringing that to life. So, on one hand, doing things like that, the other hand, doing a week's work, redesigning comp plans for an organization. So I think that variety is really interesting, but the fulfillment that comes with it is, having done what I've done for so many years, I think you develop quite a lot of patterns. So I can sort of look at patterns and very quickly assess, I've seen this story or something that looks like it before, and therefore I would recommend you do X or don't do Y. And so it's very fulfilling to know that I know some stuff and I'm quite good at what I do.
I guess you also can recognize patterns and therefore also perhaps match some of the levers that they could use in order to drive performance or whatever it might be.
Yeah, exactly. And because I'm spending quite a lot, most of my time actually with CEOs or sort of senior leaders, not all, but it just seems to be how it started. And especially when it comes to people, I think you can spot some of the patterns that mean that that person probably isn't the right fit for this stage in your growth plan. You might need to make a change. So that is definitely a pattern that I've developed.
When you first entered into sales and sales leadership, what got you into that?
So the first thing I would say is there's nobody really ever sort of wrote a career path that started somebody working in a steel mill and ending up as a chief revenue officer. So it's definitely been a career that is evolved. Interesting, because I was thinking about this the other day, actually. I was thinking that I probably, in hindsight, I was probably much more sales oriented than I ever realized, even when I was an engineer. So I wanted to go and do a summer apprenticeship in Germany, for example. So this was, I'm about to age myself, this was sort of, pre-email. So I wrote letters to lots of companies in Germany saying, would they like to have me for 2 months over the summer and pay me? That was a big pivot when I moved from engineering into the world of ERP. So I was a pre-sales manager, pre-sales leader. The second big pivot was when I moved out of pre-sales manager and I took a step back down into being an individual contributor and carrying a bag and having a quota. That actually I didn't see as a particularly big risk. It was something that I'd always been tempted by. My big motivation for doing it was twofold. One was the money, unsurprisingly. And the second one, I was just remarkably fed up with the salespeople being the ones that went to club, got on stage, and I knew I was doing a lot of the work with my team. So I was like, I have to back myself and give it a go. Made a case that I should change and move into sales. And I think that combination, by the way, of sort of pre-sales and having content and being able to sell is quite a strong combination.
Yeah, I can imagine. So as you moved into more senior sales leadership roles, I'm interested to know a bit more about what you find or what you found to be the most challenging part of the job.
So I would probably say 3 things are the most challenging that have, once you get into sales management, whether it's first line line, second line, third line or more. It's probably sort of people, number one. Number two, balancing strategy and execution. And then number three, obviously we have to talk about numbers and we have to talk about predictability of numbers. So if I was to sort of just, touch on each of those, people, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't have the right people in place, you just can't be successful, whether you're first line, whether you're board, it doesn't matter. And the thing that I have learned over the years is to make changes. If you ever think that I'll just give them one more quarter, then you kind of know the answer and it never ever works out. So I think that's both a challenge, but it's a superpower that you have to develop. So you have to have hiring as a superpower. You have to be a superpower coach. You have to really make sure that you drive change and take people with you. So yeah, I think people.
But when it comes to hiring, then, so a very simple question: when hiring, how do you know they're good?
So over the years, I've developed a sort of question framework that I use. The first thing, and I know not everyone does this, I always let people ask questions first. If somebody hasn't done their research on the company and you, and if they don't have really good questions, that's an absolute fail, because that's, job number one of being up with a customer or a prospect. And then the second thing that I always try and dig into is people's DNA, their wiring, their curiosity, what drives them, because it's hard. You have to be pretty resilient as a salesperson or as a sales leader. So I ask a lot more questions about what's in people's head than the biggest deal.
Yeah.
You probably see that as well obviously, that's what you do for a day job too.
It's our day job, but it's an interesting question is, how do you know? The truth is, can you be absolutely certain? I'm not sure you can. If we think about in our sector, the average tenure of a CRO is 18 months. Right? What would you consider to be a good hiring success rate? 2 out of 3, probably, a sales role? Don't know. What would be your view on?
Yeah, that probably goes to two out of 3 in general. Not everyone works out. I've made hiring mistakes in the past, which is one of the reasons why I've sort of corrected things. And sometimes there is just purely, there can be a culture, especially internationally. I think there's a real sort of cultural difference with US and Europe. So you can have somebody that's got the most stellar record and has smashed numbers and change.
Particularly in the US.
In the US, that exactly gets an allergic reaction in Europe. Lots of lessons there.
Yeah, so let's go back up to what you've the most challenging parts of the role. You were talking about the people piece first.
I think the other thing that I've learned, and happily I've learned that I'm good at this, is being both strategic and tactical at the same time. So sort of balancing strategy and execution. It can be really hard. So, I spend a lot of time with the board and you're talking about strategy. Do we go enterprise? Do we go mid-market? Do we open up an office in the Middle East? Do we go into France? Do we develop a strategic partnership? Do we redo our pricing? So, you're doing really big picture stuff sometimes. Should we do an M&A, whatever? And then, literally 2 minutes after that call's finished, you're doing a deal review, getting into legal negotiation with a customer, etc. A lot of context switching is needed, and, that can be very tiring. So I am very fortunate, actually. I've learned that I'm very good at that, which I think turned out to be a bit of a superpower of mine. But you do get to the end of the day and you go, oh, goodness, I've just had 17 meetings today, here, there, and all this context switching. So, again, things I've learned is you can have to look after yourself as much as you can and get some downtime. So yeah, I think that balance is critical.
One of our PROs that we placed who's been very successful is establishing the right operating rhythm. This particular individual is really prescriptive about, in fact, he's one of the guys we've interviewed, CRO Total Mobile, very prescriptive about his day and his week and his month. And he shares that with anybody who's interested, people reporting into him or the board or whoever else. So this is what I'm up to. I guess the trick is to stick to it, right? Is adherence.
You do. And, obviously there'll be an event, there'll be a customer thing, there'll be an advisory board, whatever that comes in. But yeah, I think the baseline, the operating drumbeat or rhythm of the numbers, I don't think I've been quite as systematic as that of how to put the other stuff in. But yeah, the cadence of the numbers, your one-to-ones, deal reviews, QBRs, all of that is table stakes for sure. I mean, the last thing, obviously, as a CRO sales leader, you can't talk about the challenges without talking about numbers and predictability. That is the actual job. And I think because I've spent my career working, once I left SAP, it was, it's pretty much always been venture, private equity, going through an IPO. So the numbers have always been stretching. And I've never allocated anybody a target that's anything other than stretching either. Therefore, getting the predictability, we were just talking about, weren't we, about your operating rhythm, getting everything that goes with the insight onto the deals and the predictability that goes with that, the linearity is just super critical, whether it's new business, whether you're doing some churn prevention, whether it's expansion, that predictability is just huge because companies make decisions. Are you going to do an acquisition? Are you going to hire? Are you going to open up a new market? So I would say the challenge is it can be quite lonely because ultimately it's your call. Other people can input, but at the end of the day, it's your call.
I think being on the hook for revenue in the boardroom's a tough gig. In my experience, often the first person that they'll point to when things aren't going well, right?
Of course. And by the way, that's the job you sign up for, right? Don't ever take a CRA job or any sales leadership role unless you know that accountability. And I have an image. I wake up every morning with a number on my forehead. That's actually the first thing that comes to mind when I wake up in the morning. Do we have X million to go in the quarter? It just, comes with the territory.
I'm curious, just tell me quickly, you touched on about stretching targets. What would be your approach to creating a set of targets where the aggregate team target has a buffer in, I'm guessing what you would have done, and how you get that stretch right so that the individual feels it's still attainable, that no one else feels like they're getting an easy ride? And
let's define stretch. I mean, stretch has got to be what is definitely achievable plus a bit. It's not 3 times. If somebody asked me to go and run 100 meters in 10 seconds, I wouldn't get out of the chair. Somebody would say to me, go and run 100 meters in, I don't know, to be honest, I have no idea how quickly I'd run 100 meters, but, let's say in 30 seconds, I don't know, whatever.
You definitely do it in 30 seconds.
I'd give it a go, I'd give it a go. Could I do that? I don't know. I'd give it a go for sure. So I think it's that balance between, as you say, you need to be highly motivating. Lots of organizations will, deliberately plan to have 40% of their quota carriers hit their number. Now, I'm not a fan of that, if I'm honest. So when I was at a very big company many years ago, you knew that very few people had actually hit their number. Managers hadn't hit their number, the region hadn't hit their number, but somehow at a company level, the company had hit their number. You're like, the level of buffer and over assign on that was just so dramatic that I think that backfires, because then if people can't see a way to their number, that's me running 100 meters in 10 seconds. So they leave, they go. I'm more used to, and I prefer to model 75-80% of their people going to hit their quota. Your fairness is a really interesting question. I think fairness in how you treat people, it's a core value of mine, but it's not just a quota. You need to give people a fair territory. You need to give them the fair support, and you need to, the target goes with that. So it's not just a target standalone.
You've got almost a mini plan for that individual, so that's attainable, whether it's volume of counts or whatever it might be. If you stand up in front of your team, you need to stand up and say these are attainable. There might be a bit of a stretch, but they're perfectly attainable. We're just going to go for it. The moment you believe they're not attainable, it doesn't work for me.
You might get some great performance for 1 quarter or 2, but everybody else is going to be brushing up their CVs, and and also sort of poor practice. That's where you're going to might risk a bit of overselling, or then that just hits churn. Obviously, you and I live in a B2B SaaS world. You need to sell good deals as well as hit the number.
Yeah, interesting. So what are the biggest lessons that you've learned? Probably touched on some of them already.
Yeah, we've got good deal there. Well, funny enough, when I stepped out of CRO world, I actually sort of stepped back and I gave that some thought. Spoiler alert, I did actually write an article that's on LinkedIn back in March. So that's where that sits. So I'd put 5 things on there. More headcount doesn't equal more revenue. Work smarter, hire good people, etc. Get the right profile off that headcount. So just chucking bodies in can backfire for a lot of reasons. Second lesson that I learned, and I've learned this every single role I've ever done, including when I was one, is your first line managers are absolutely pivotal. They will make or break you. I think it's actually, along with being an SDR, I think being a first line sales leader is the hardest job, because you're really, close to the field. You are that intersection with that predictability that we just talked about. So making sure that they are the right people and they are coached and really developed, because that's a hard job. Third thing that when I reflected was pipeline integrity versus size of pipe. So yes, we always want lots and lots of pipeline, but if that just is a pipeline that's carrying on from 1 quarter to another, then it's not genuine pipeline. So actually really making sure that this is where the nuts and bolts of the job comes in. Your sales stage, entry exit criteria, all of that has to be both rigorous, but it has to be adhered to, so that you can really know whether your pipe is good. Fourth thing, and I've done a lot of this, is international expansion. So international expansion is a real company decision. It's one of the things that I reflected on. You can't just, and I've done this is why I know that it's a bad thing to do, is just chucking some people into a home office in a new region. You might get lucky, but you really, really need to make sure you've got the product, you've got legal support, you've got any localization, you've got the right partner strategy. So the opportunistic just doesn't work. So you really need to, really buy into it. And then the last thing, revenue leadership, is cross-functional. I know in some organizations the CRO has marketing under them. I've had marketing in the past. I've not had marketing. So that's a real critical one, where that CRO CMO interaction is, it's got to be one shared pipe, one shared metrics, but also the cross-functional aspect with product as well. That feedback loop is absolutely critical. Yes, plus finance, yes, plus HR, but I would always really double down on that chemistry and the collaboration day to day between sales, marketing and product is just huge.
Yeah, so even if it doesn't report in, they'll be working very closely.
Yeah, right. And I've been really fortunate in the past to work with some awesome marketing people, but I've also worked in the world where, marketing's green and, revenue's red, and you've got to fix that. That's just toxic.
Do you think you probably should report into the CRO?
I'm entirely neutral, if I'm honest. Perhaps this is a little bit of insight into Helen's brain. I'm extremely indifferent to reporting lines and org structures. You've got to have a primary and secondary for something. So you can organize for geography, you can organize for channel, you can organize for product line, etc. Segment. It sort of doesn't matter as long as you've got the right collaboration going
You're
on.
working well together.
Exactly. So customer success, marketing, operations, should they all sit under a CRO? I think you just have to behave as though they all report to you anyway, even if they don't. More usually they have done for me, but
we see an awful lot of variation. We see all sorts of different structures, as one might expect. I think it also depends on the priorities for the organisation and the stage that they're at as well.
Exactly. And so long as you've got the right people and the right collaboration, it kind of doesn't matter which is probably why you see such a variety of models. The one thing I do think needs to be together, ideally structurally, but certainly joined at the hip, is new business and existing business. So again, we could probably do a whole hour on ownership of the customer. What happens when you close a deal, land and expand? Do you have an AE, AM, CSM? Do you have technical account managers? There's a million different schools of thought on that. But the one thing that if you just have new business and customer existing business, if you have those very separate, I think that causes a real problem, because I don't think you get the expansion that you would want, and you just risk the deals that are being sold aren't necessarily going to be the best deals. I'm religious about NRR, non-recurring revenue, because at the end of the day, everyone talks about the leaking bucket, but it's a real thing. There's no point filling the funnel with new business, awesome deals, and you can make your CAC look amazing. But if they're churning out because there were poor deals or the handovers were rubbish, then your company ARR is going to be massively compromised.
So you talk about the new biz and account management, or the CS function sitting quite separately, not a good thing. Is it easy to explain how you believe they should be better integrated then?
Take the roles out of it for a minute. If I think about the customer journey, recently I've run quite a few customer journey mapping sessions actually with some of my customers on this, because it's really important. Ignore your own role definition. Who's the person that was responsible for acquisition of a new customer? Who's the person that's going to be responsible for servicing that customer, onboarding them, helping them with adoption, value realization? Who's the person that's going to be responsible for commercially for renewals, commercially for expansions? Now those could all be one person potentially if you're in a smaller, perhaps mid-market type environment with a pool of technical ability, or they could all be very different roles, and they could be different by geography, even if you're servicing a really big client. So that's why I think really stepping back and just looking at what does the customer need, who does those handovers between each of those stages in the journey is huge for me, because where things go wrong is where I'm the new business salesperson and I'm handing something over to you, Will, as the person person that's responsible for an account, if I don't do a good handover to you, you're setting yourself up for a deteriorated value realization from the customer from the outset. So they don't have to all be different roles. They can be merged. So yeah, I think it's a really evolving school of thought because it's, people are expensive as well. So making sure that you do step back, look at that customer journey and then figure out what you can actually afford to do to service and how can you use a lot of automation, for example.
Have you ever linked the variable comp of a new bid salesperson with their performance of their stock after, let's say, the first year renewal?
So stock as in equity?
No, stock as in their subscription, the business they win, whether it renews or not, and whether they should be remunerated, whether that should be linked at all, or whether it's just the job is to win that client, not to be concerned with whether they renew or not.
Yeah, absolutely. If they keep hold of the account. So I think there are a few different things. Comp plans, I love it, by the way. Favorite topic. Give me geeking out on comp plans. You'll never get me off it. So just like to answer that very specific one, yes. And the most typical way is obviously giving somebody an incremental ARR target. Let's say they start with 10 million is their book. You give them a quota of, I don't know, 2 million incremental. You can either have 2 million new business, 2 million expansion. But if you lose a million, you then need to get 3. That would be your most simple way of doing it. I think you need to be a bit careful on who actually owns and who is responsible then for the value realization and the adoption. That's why, again, I think you need to look at the customer journey because it's not fair to penalize somebody if they played no part in that adoption. Long conversation I could have there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, designing the comp plans so they drive the right behaviours. Wow. Could be here for another half a day, probably, easily. It's an interesting subject. And it's interesting how often we see clients getting it wrong.
There's lots of things that are important, but the reason I'm massively passionate about comp plans is because if you do get it wrong, you drive the wrong behaviour, you'll get channel conflict, you'll get all of the above.
So on that team and building the right culture, how do you go about building a fantastic team, a high-performing team?
I think the trick and a sort of catchphrase of mine has always been you can have high performance and you can have a good culture at the same time. I'm a big person for transparency, so sharing super transparently what the numbers are, leaderboards. I have had a cultural moment in the past where I put leaderboards up in my quarterly all hands and got complaints because that was a cultural. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, actually, the business thought it wasn't appropriate, is it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly, because it felt like a name and shame, but welcome to sales, right? Funny enough, none of the salespeople complained. It was other parts of the company. So I think, transparency.
Were you sharing the entire leaderboard?
I was sharing people that had made it onto the leaderboard, for all roles, BDRs, SDRs, AEs, AMs, CSMs, pre-sales. Yeah, why wouldn't you need it? I mean, that's your high performance, but then the cultural piece that goes with it, making sure that you are very thoughtful about how you coach people to make sure that they are all successful, making sure that people just sort of feel part of the business. It got quite tricky in COVID, and actually during COVID, one of the things I started doing was a weekly video over the weekend or on a Friday night. I'd record just a sort of 4 or 5 minute video that what was top of mind because I knew I wasn't going to be bumping into people in an office or traveling to a different office. I wasn't going to be seeing everyone. So, I couldn't communicate with 150 people all at once. I just got into the habit of doing a weekly video, which would be what was top of mind, highlights, things to think about. MedPick series, today's video was brought to you by the letter M, 2 minutes on metrics, for example. And I continued doing that, actually. That was very, very well received.
Yeah, good idea. I like that.
Feel free to use that one.
Yeah, I might suggest that. Linked then, when you think about people in the industry, who stood out to you as one of a particularly strong revenue leader, one of the top revenue leaders you've ever worked with? What do you think make him or her so successful?
When I sort of sit back and think about people that, I think some of the top leaders have been, interestingly, some of the people that I used to work for in my times at SAP, they've been such strong leaders in my mind that I've followed them. I'm sure most of these people. So somebody like Jose Duarte, who used to run SAP for EMEA, I followed him to Unit 4 around the UK there, and he was just extraordinary in customer situations. And I learned a huge amount from him, including one of the most practical tips, which is if you're out on the road doing exec meetings all day, always have a good breakfast. And I'd be briefing him and hotels in the morning. And these people are all still mentors of mine. Peter Hefner is, continued to meet me. I learned a ton about negotiation from him, multi-million deals. The biggest deal I've ever done personally was a 24 million pound deal. And, he helped me with that negotiation. That's not for the faint-hearted. And he also gave me an amazing tip, which was to appear more senior, Helen, talk slower, which I'm sure I'm breaking here, but tips like that. And then one of my more recent leaders, Christine Mills, who I worked for, she's our CRO at at Data Miner, who again, I've stayed in touch with her. She is still a mentor for me. How she sort of did a lot of cross-functional stakeholder management. So I learned a lot from that. So lots and lots of people, Chris McLean, Chana Fernandez. Yeah, there's a lot of people that I've learned from and are very fortunate to still be in touch with.
Sounds like it. And where do you go for drawing inspiration? Well, those people, I suppose, are part of that. I'm guessing. But do you have any other sort of coaches or mentors or places where you go to draw inspiration?
So I think some of the names that I've just given you, pretty much my sort of professional mentors, amongst others. And in terms of inspiration, I sort of avidly consume information, actually. I'm a bit of a closet economics person, and politics seems like the rest is politics and political currency. I love listening to Positive Momentum, the network that I'm part of. We do an absolutely awesome Meet the CEO and Meet the CRO series. So I've learned loads from there. New Role do a terrific Path to the Boardroom. I've listened to some of your interviews, Will, that you've done with people. There was a great one with Yana that I listened to. And then I read books. So my rule is read a business book a month. So at the minute it's all on AI. I did a really fascinating AI course earlier in the year at Oxford University. So the last thing, because I've sort of stepped out of full-time corporate world to sort of bring that to multiple people as more of a consultant, advisor on board, I've gone through quite an identity shift. So I've actually got a personal coach that's just making me sort of reassess how I thrive in a world where it's hopefully not 14-hour days, 6 days a week anymore in corporate, and that change. So yeah, lots of different people.
I can imagine. Really appreciate you joining the call. Some fantastic insights. Look forward to sharing with everybody in our network. Thanks very much.